there was terror. There was great terror. Terror because I'd lost everything I thought of as me. There was a sense of self as well. There was a self that was aware of what was going on. But that was not a self that I could impose an identity on. It was just, it was observing, and there was freedom, and there was terror. The terror was probably coming from this finite sense of self that was bewildered and which had been reduced to something very small.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Arundhathi Subramaniam, and I'm delighted to be on Your Superior Self.
Very happy to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed your book, Women Who Wear Only Themselves. For me, it was fascinating because it gave me a different perspective about women who are a guru, are considered a guru, and within your tradition or traditions coming out of India, which I had no idea that they were doing the work that they were doing until I read your book. So thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show and writing this book.
Thank you, Trey. I'm glad you read the book. You know, the point was really to talk about the multiple women that there are, so many of whom remain undocumented. Trey, I grew up in Bombay, it's a city of many names. It's called Bombay, Mumbai, Bombay. It has many names, many languages. It's hectically cosmopolitan. It's a crazy city. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and it was a great place to be. And at the same time, I think unconsciously, I was always a seeker, never quite knowing it. I thought that my answers were going to come largely, given my liberal, secular, modern education, for which I'm grateful. But I thought that my answers would come largely from the arts, from poetry, from theater, from dance, all the things that I loved. But there came a time in my life, and this happened around 1997, when something shifted very decisively. It was an experience for which I had no name. And for want of a better phrase, I call it a near-death experience. All I can say is it was a pivotal moment in my life. It was an experience that lasted about a week. And as it started fading, I knew that I was a conscious seeker now. I could no longer be just someone who pretended to be a practitioner of poetry, you know, in one compartment of my life, and in another compartment was actually looking for answers that never seemed forthcoming. So what was this experience? I'd say it was essentially an experience, as for me, of great emptiness. And nothing had prepared me for it. I'd spent a lot of my time reading philosophy. I thought at one time I would study it. But all the philosophy I had read, all the Eastern mystics I had read, nothing seemed to come to my aid. And, well, let me say this. Later, when I started coming out of it, the one thing that I did know was that I needed guidance to understand what had happened. I also needed guidance because I sensed that this was the truest experience I had ever had. Although it was terrifying because there were no reference points, there was just this great emptiness. Everything around me seemed shadowy. But I realized that I desperately needed guidance because this experience was the real thing and this was going to recur. That was my sense, that this is where I came from and I was going to return to this. And I had to make my peace with this terror, whatever it was. To some degree, the mystics that I read, not the philosophers, not the metaphysicians, but the mystics that I read thirstily after that experience helped. So I read St. John of the Cross, I read the Zen poets, I returned feverishly to read the Buddha. I read a lot of the Indian mystic poets, Nammalvar, Kabir, Tukaram, and many of them seemed to suggest in this very in the way that only poetry does, really. When the finest mystic poets achieve this, there's a sense of pointing to something that seems deeply familiar, strange, and yet deeply familiar, and just out of reach. So that, in some ways, spoke to me deeply, but it wasn't enough. It seemed to me that these were people who knew what it was like to go there, whether accidentally, like, I had stumbled on it, or otherwise. They seemed to know, but they hadn't really left behind a manual on how to come to terms with it and how to get there. So that's when I realized I needed a guide, a living guide. I looked and I didn't find until 7 years later.
Hmm.
And those were 7 long years of seeking.
Sure. Well, the near death experience, or is it near death? Like, did you almost die, or was it like an awakening? Was it what
I
was
think it was
that?
a bit of both. I think it was, probably looking back now, it was an awakening. But it felt like death to me because it was the death of everything familiar. And all that I had loved, the people around me, my partner, my cats, who were very dear to me, all of them seemed like shadows. So it just felt like all the things I had prized, all the things I had treasured, just seemed vacant.
Hmm.
And that felt like death. But I realized it was an awakening because it shifted the furniture of my life around. It turned things over. I wasn't the same again. And nothing in my life has been the same again since.
What were you doing when this happened?
I was, you mean in my life generally, or at that moment?
Well, at that moment when it took
At
place.
that moment, I just returned from a very relaxed holiday in Nepal. I was on a train coming back from, I'd gone to Delhi and then Delhi back to Bombay. And it was I was at peace, I was at ease, but I will also mention that I started reading the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying, which is a book that I felt called to pick up when I was in a bookstore in Delhi. My mother gifted it to me. And I'd asked her, I said I wanted it, and she gave it to me. And reading it, something started to shift. But I read many books before. I have read the same book since, and I haven't had this experience. I've also recommended it to many others. It's not that they've had the same experience. So I think it's a whole concatenation of factors that comes together. And you are in a state of readiness. Something speaks to you and touches you in a particular place, and things get catalyzed in a way that you never imagined.
Were you seeking then, or were you just kind of living your life on autopilot?
I think I was seeking, as I said, in an unconscious way. So I'd always been drawn to poetry because I felt that asked existential questions. The other disciplines didn't seem to allow for that. The arts seemed to allow for that. I was seeking because when I look back on the stories that I wrote as a child, as a 10-year-old, I was asking questions in my own juvenile way. I was asking questions about living and dying and loss and death. What did it mean to be a little chick in a farmyard yearning for freedom? What did it mean to be a cloud in the sky, threatened by the loss of identity, even though a cloud is just vapor? What does it mean when a cloud ceases to be a cloud? So these are questions that obviously were churning somewhere, Trey.
Hmm.
And I think as I told you, I believed that just reading philosophy would be enough. And it wasn't. Nothing prepared me for the 97 experience.
Wow. What was your religious background growing up?
Well, I grew up Hindu, but Hindu in the kind of liberal Hindu that is, I think, really the norm even today, despite all sorts of strains that seem to want to standardize it. It was liberal, it was very relaxed, it was culturally rich, but it didn't entail any kind of dogmatic faith at all. I had a father who was probably somewhere between agnostic and seeker. I had a mother who enjoyed. You know, the thing about religion in India is it enters you in all kinds of ways. So you're accustomed to hearing wonderful devotional music, which my mother sang. You're accustomed to going to a temple every now and then and just hanging around and not doing very much. It's just, and every second shrine on your road is a sacred shrine. There are sacred shrines, at least one down every street. So there are just so many insidious ways in which the sacred, or the attempt to invoke the sacred, is always there in India. So I think the relaxed approach to it, at the same time, the ubiquity of it, it was everywhere. I think that might have helped now, looking back in some way, because had it been a more rigid upbringing, I would have spent a lot of my time, knowing myself, I'd have spent a lot of my time revolting. And then that would have taken up a lot more headspace and heart space and a lot more energy. So I'm glad I didn't do much revolting. I didn't have much to revolt against, because it seemed I had access to Indian philosophy. My father's bookshelves were full of that. But none of it entailed doctrine or dogma of any kind.
So here in the States, obviously, our major religion is Christianity. I've read a lot of Yogananda's work and Sri M, and I've heard about Sadhguru and his philosophies, and watched some of his YouTube channels, and become more aware about Kriya Yoga and things of that nature.
Yes.
But it seems, and also more of late, I've been diving into some of the Greco-Roman philosophy, Socrates, Plato, some of the ancient thinkers, even Gnosticism, and how they interpret the world. What's the origin story? They're all different, but they all have archetypes associated with them. And when you had this awakening, did you have any realization? Did you have like that sacred unity, that oneness that they always talk about, the gnosis?
All I can say is it felt like a great encounter with emptiness. And perhaps I was too scared to go further. When I read Ramana Maharishi, the great 20th century mystic of India, he mentions that his awakening happened in his teens with a death experience. And he says it overwhelmed him, and he lay flat on his bed and allowed it to happen. And he allowed it perhaps more than I did, because he said there was terror, but he went beyond that. And maybe I stopped with the terror, but it just seemed to me a state completely bleached of reference points. Completely. So none of the maps, none of the directions that I had, none of the sense of who I was held. But I was functional on another level. I mean, I got up that week and I was doing things, but constantly saying, what's going on? What's going on? Physically, I was fine. I was able to sit down and have a meal. I even went out. I even met a couple of people. All that happened. But it just felt like nothing added up. But I will also say at the same time, it wasn't a state of I wasn't gloomy. I was more alive than ever before. I wasn't in a melancholic state. I wasn't in a depressed state. I just felt very alive. And as I started coming out of that experience, I realized colors seemed brighter than ever before. And the one thing I will say, it seemed like a state of great freedom. Because not having those reference points, not having any definition to hold on to, also means you are free to define yourself any way you want. And that was a kind of unstained sense of self. Let's put it that way. Because there was a self. There was a self that was aware of what was going on. So it wasn't like that had gone away. It's just my identity, the way I thought of myself, had gone. So
is that like ego self? Is that ego transcendence? Is that where the persona falls away?
Way, a kind of puncturing of the ego that happened, some aperture, some portal, that got through to a deeper part of the self. That's really something seemed to have opened up. I also knew then, Trey, why some of the mystics of India, there are at least, well, even not just of India, if we were to think of, the modern, one of the modern mystics, U.G. Krishnamurti, speaks of his enlightenment as a great calamity. So I also had a sense of why he meant that, because there is something calamitous about everything shifting around in your life. maybe momentous and exciting, but also seemingly calamitous, because we are invested in so many things. So a big mix of both. I hope now, with several years of that have intervened and several years of practice of my own meditation practice and yoga, I hope I'm just a little more prepared for an experience like that if it were to happen again.
Mm. So 7 years after this experience, you're kind of just trying to put the pieces back together again. Now, is that because like your paradigm has been totally cracked open and you're just trying to, I guess, reintegrate into this reality? It
Yes.
sounds like everything you talk about, this great emptiness. A lot of people have talked about it as the void. It's very ineffable, and people have a problem finding words to associate this state of being or state of consciousness. And then when coming back to this place, it can be really hard for people to move through this world because those labels that you placed upon things, now you're seeing the actuality of them, and the meaning is totally different. So I've had, I guess, a slow recognition of the persona as Trey, understanding that everything that I thought that I was is essentially just an idea or concept that was painted onto me, and
Yeah.
to dive into the self, the inner self, to really know thyself. What Jung calls the individuation process,
Yeah.
where you're making the unconscious conscious. But there's a fear associated with that, because it's like, do I really want to look inside of myself and find the aspects that I'm so fearful of? And you
Hmm.
said there was no fear at all in this state?
Well, there was terror, more than fear. There was terror. There was great terror. Terror because I'd lost everything I thought of as me. But there was a sense of self as well. There was a self that was aware of what was going on. But that was not a self that I could impose an identity on. It was observing, and there was freedom, and there was terror. The terror was probably coming from this finite sense of self that was bewildered, and which had been reduced to something very small. You know,
Sure.
there was terror.
How do you reintegrate back into this place?
It's a good question, really. I think I was honestly a bit of an imposter. I felt like an imposter for many years after that. I had a seemingly functional life. I was working. I worked as a journalist, a curator. I was fundamentally a poet. I was doing readings. I had a book of poems out. I was doing lots of stuff, but on a subterranean level, I think I was nothing but a seeker, desperately looking. So I joined all kinds of self-help courses and meditation programs, and attended satsangs with people who were considered to be, well, awakened. And I gained, I learned, but I did not find anyone whom I thought could be my guide, my kind of guide. So at a certain point in 2004, I think around late 2003, I kind of gave up. I said, it's not going to happen. The days of gurus are long past. And, this kind of magic connection between disciple and guru and stuff is fine for the books. You read the books and you derive your strength from there, and experience. Life will be your guide. That's what I thought until I met my guru in 2004, and felt a deep sense of recognition, but approached it cautiously. Something huge had happened inside when I first heard a talk by him, but I approached it cautiously, and I took it step by step, because I wanted to be very aware of what was going on. And also, there is a certain trust in any kind of teacher-student relationship. You want that trust to build. You don't want to take the plunge and then end up playing a blame game later. So I took it cautiously. But let me also say that I met him in 2004. This is Sadhguru, incidentally. This is
Oh,
Sadhguru.
wow.
Yeah. So I attended a talk by him in 2004, attended a program the very next day. By 2006, I had done all the programs. More than anything, when I met him after the first program and said I wanted to meet him over a cup of coffee, that's what I said to him. And he said, come to the ashram and we'll have a conversation. And so I went to the ashram a few months later, and we had that conversation. And what struck me was that he knew where I was at without my having to say anything at all. So he got to it. He suggested something that I might do, a program I might do, which I did, 2006, I finished the programs. I had already gotten to know him much better. And when we were on a walk, I remember in the ashram, he said, write a biography. So I did. I have written Sadhguru's biography, which is out in 2010. And that was happening on, one part of my life as a writer. I was writing my poetry, I was doing prose, wrote a book on the Buddha, I wrote a book on Sadhguru. Life started shifting in many ways after I found a practice. So I think what Sadhguru gave me most of all was the sure-footedness, as I say in the book, of the Guru's presence. It doesn't mean, yes, I knew him, I know him, but it's not about the person really. As the process deepens, it's about what the practice is allowing you to access within yourself. So to me, that's really remained the index of a teacher. Does he or she empower you to become more you? I think as long as we are trying to become clones of our teachers or trying to mimic them unconsciously, it's not going to work. It has to be about where this practice meets you. And so I think allowing that to deepen has helped enormously, Trey. I feel more myself. I feel there's more breathing space for me to be me. Whereas earlier, I always felt, and I say this in my book on Sadhguru, I said, I always felt like other people were round pegs in round holes and I was the trapezium. Now it actually felt like maybe there's more room for trapeziums in the world.
What is it about that time, like metaphorically being in the desert, right? And then when you
Mm.
finally find paradise, it just seems like home. Like why do we need to go through the desert, right? Is it to know truth?
When you're in the desert, everything seems like a platitude. But I think I've known dryness as a creative practitioner. One knows dryness. It's very closely linked to spiritual dryness as well. Why do we go through it? I think maybe it is for one, creatively, I always tell myself, we were never meant to live in perpetual states of fecundity. We are meant to go through, the field is fallow for a period of time in order to be truly fertile. So I think these are the rhythms of the natural world anyway. Periods of where you lie low, where things are actually happening on some very deep level in the soil, things are happening, but you may not be aware of it. More you deepen your life experience, you are actually aware that things are moving. So that's one explanation. What kept me going, Trey, was the poets, the mystic poets. St. John of the Cross and his Dark Night of the Senses and the Dark Night of the Soul. Tukaram, the 17th century Indian poet who says, when he comes out of the blue, a meteorite shattering your home, be sure God is visiting you. To me, these were just reminders that what seems like aridity is often not arid at all. The very same mystic I mentioned earlier, the 20th century mystic Ramana Maharishi, apparently told someone who was thirsting to see him and have that view, a darshan of him, just behold him. He says, the desire for darshan, that thirst, that what you're calling the desert right now, the thirst that drives you mad, the thirst for darshan is often more powerful than darshan itself, which means that something transformative is actually going on in that desert that is not often, not at all, in fact, apparent to us when we are going through it.
I love that. Yeah, I read again Yogananda's work, like a lot of his work, and there's
Yes.
this part. But I think about what's the difference in your quote. Actually, in your book, you talk about the difference between being a doormat and a devotee.
Mm.
And I think back to Yogananda's. I don't know if it's his. I've read so many different books. Sri M. They talk about Babaji,
Yes.
and the story where this guy climbs up a mountain, and I guess he's in that desert season of his life, and he has nothing that will quench his thirst, and he wants to be Babaji's devotee,
Mm-hmm.
and Babaji essentially turns him away and was like, "No, I'm not. I don't want to have anything to do with you." And the guy throws himself off the mountain and dies, right? And then Babaji goes down and brings him up to be his devotee. And it's kind of like, how do you discern, right, for yourself how or what the difference is between being a doormat or like a devotee, like in a healthy sense. You know what I mean? Not like to your point of having these attachments, unhealthy attachments and
Yeah,
expectations.
such a good question. So in my head, I thought of myself as a little more cerebral. I didn't think of myself as a devotee until, my this whole journey began, and then I discovered that there was no way I could just inhabit some tranquil place in my head without acknowledging the heart. And I was plunged straight into the heart when my practices started to intensify. After I met Sadhguru and I was practicing daily Kriya Yoga and the meditation, I was plunged straight into the heart, the mess of the heart, the the indignity of the heart, really, because it throws up all sorts of things you thought you weren't about that, and there it is, waiting to be confronted and negotiated. So that's when I realized there is this huge tumultuous emotional life. The only way that I could navigate it was by seeing myself as what we call in India a bhakta, a devotee. I was a devotee. But then it also struck me that I felt as I was going through that experience that I needed in my writing. Let me say I was aware of it going through it, but when I started making more sense of it later, I felt I needed to reframe the way in which we look at devotion, because so often devotion is presented in sacred literature as some kind of becoming a little puddle of servitude at the feet of the master or the feet of the divine. And I've always, as growing up and reading that kind of stuff, it never really touched me. It never spoke to me. I felt that was in fact becoming what you call a doormat, as I also say in the book. Civility, for God's sake, we were spending a lot of our time talking about freedom. What was the civility about? But I think I realized after my own experience deepened, and as I then started reclaiming as a reader the mystic poets, I realized that in the finest poetry, and I'm not talking, there's a lot of poetry that I don't relate to, but in the finest mystic poetry, this is not about submission to authority. This is about surrender to love. So far too often we get caught up with the hierarchies of this, but the best mystic poetry blurs the hierarchies. There are poems in which the devotee says, I am the master and God is my slave. And in the very next breath says the reverse. And I think it's only when you experience the tumult of the bhakta, of the devotee within, that you recognize that the two can coexist effortlessly, because you're actually being invited to a space where all these hierarchies are melting away. So it's really not about being servile at all. Bhakti, as I see it, and as I talk about it in this book, is about reclaiming a much deeper sense of self. And I think, particularly for me as a woman, and I hope for other women, I hope this will resonate, because it's not about, far too often we are being asked to surrender a self that we have never even been encouraged to honor. You have to first honor yourself and then know what it is to give it away. So to be able to fritter away yourself is not bhakti. Bhakti is about reclaiming your sense of spine, reclaiming your sense of self, but it is also about a ferocious commitment to your inner life. That commitment, that fierce commitment, is what devotion actually is. So it's not servility, though from the outside, those who sometimes look in on a guru, a student relationship, or those who look in on a devotee divine relationship, sometimes it just feels like they've just become slaves. But a true relationship of that kind will never entail enslavement. It's essentially about freedom. It may go through a period of great discipline. You may go through that period. Discipline that happens because there is trust in what this person might have to offer. But I think the index that we all need to keep alive and kicking in our heads is this journey freeing me to be more myself? Or is it turning me into some kind of enslaved entity? If it is turning you into that, you need to be a little watchful.
Yeah, there's been horror stories, right? Of like the false gurus and
Yes.
all of the abuse that is associated with that.
Totally.
Of course, right? And it seems like in all religious establishments or hierarchies, or I mean, the West has it as well. How do you translate though these concepts from your philosophy, from your heritage into Western um, mindsets, or how do you translate your experience for us to understand? Because we see it as, to your point, surrendering the self to to a hierarchy of being, and it's like a lot of Westerners scoff at this because it's not what we want to be. The individual, we want to be the person, the hero, or the hero's journey. We want to do everything by ourselves, right? And to think of surrendering self to someone
Mm.
and becoming this to your point, a slave essentially, doing all the things, living in an ashram up in a mountain, almost escaping from society. Like
Mm.
how does that help me live here, right? Like how does it help me in this reality
Totally.
be a better person or expand my spiritual awareness?
Yeah, so I will say that I didn't, yes, I am Indian and attempting to translate it, but I will also say that being an urban Indian today is not so different. We also prize our individuality and our freedom. So these were difficult negotiations for me to make. I'm sure many of my friends back home in Mumbai, when I moved to an ashram, thought I was either having a midlife crisis or that I had fallen prey to the charisma of some guru. So, I'm sure they had their own narratives around it. So I'll say this, Trey. I'd say it's two things. One is certainly you need to trust your teacher, but it's the way in which, and I'm deliberately using a very, well, not a profane metaphor, but a very, very worldly one. It's a bit in the way you trust your swimming instructor. The swimming instructor is there. You trust him or her to teach you how to stay afloat. And it is an essentially unsentimental relationship, that one. And if you learn how to stay afloat, you might actually trust her or him to teach you a few more strokes after that. You learn those. And after that, you let go. This requires letting go on both sides. It's not just the guru who attempts, there are all these stories about the predatory guru who's trying to, just who's trying to enslave you or trying to just win recruits or more acolytes. That's one figure. But the other figure is also you as a seeker or as a devotee. You have to find your way of figuring out what you want to be here. Are you in this relationship in order to become free, or do you want to become just another fan and acquire a new identity as chief disciple? Is that what you're looking for? If you want to be chief disciple, with the spotlights on you every time the guru is interviewed or whatever, that's that's a cop out, right? I mean, you also have to look at yourself. So I think it's a two-way thing. You can refuse to be a victim. You can be very clear. You need to be clear about why you're entering this relationship, what you hope to get from it. And I think I would suggest this to anyone every now and then, say 2 years into your practice. Look at it and see if it has helped you. If it
Hmm.
has helped you, it doesn't matter whether you agree with everything the guru says. It doesn't matter whether you like him all the time. Doesn't matter. Even the people you live with, we often don't like every minute of the day. Doesn't matter. Something meeting you where you're at, and is it deepening you? Is it empowering you? Is it making you a freer, happier human being? That's the only thing that counts. Otherwise, you just can get caught up in looking at one person or the other. You either look at your beloved, or you look at your boss, or you look at your guru. What's the difference? No one's ever going to be all that we want them to be, any more than we are all that we want to be. So I think not to get caught up in the idol worship of it, you know?
Sure. You have four amazing women in this book.
Mhm.
Four amazing women. Now, are these gurus? Because I know in the Catholic Church there cannot be female priests, and I don't know about this, but like, are these? I'm assuming these are gurus, right, with their own ashrams and devotees.
Not all of them. So two of them do have their ashrams, and two of them don't. Two of them are. One of them is an informal guide, and the other is a monk. I just wanted her because she's leading a quiet monastic life. So that's why I call them spiritual travelers. They're not all teachers in a formal sense of the term. And I would say, of course, there is always a difference between a priest and a guru. A
Really?
priest is always different. So, likewise, back in India, there are questions about who can be a priest, and there are questions of orthodoxy that have to be navigated by a person. But that was never my area of interest. I'm interested in someone who seems lit up from the inside. What does it mean to be lit up from the inside? And to me, these women have that quality of radiance. So that made me curious. And I can't judge their spiritual attainments. I just know that I loved the time I spent listening to them, talking to them.
Wow. So that's an interesting point, right? So the difference between a priest and a guru. Is there a difference between religion and I don't even know what would you call like the guru path? Is that the spiritual path? Is that more
Yeah.
unconventional, like self-realization path, where religion is more orthodoxy to your point, more rigid, what Nietzsche would call, or when he used that quote, God is dead, kind of comparing, religion to not having God present in the sense that it doesn't light you up like Yogananda's self-realization tradition.
Yes. I think there's always a difference between the mystic and the priest. There has always been a difference between the seeker and the soldier. Every faith has its soldiers. The seekers are always different. So, at the heart of every religious tradition, as I say in the introduction to the book, at the heart of it lies a certain mystical insight. The fire of that insight is probably what gave birth to it in the first place. But then, in order to preserve that fire, I think we do many things. We create institutions, we evolve scriptures, and somewhere along the way, that the utter fierce radiance of that fire can be dimmed. And so, very often, for many of us, organized religion is not where we find our answers. We often have to look elsewhere for them. And when we start uncovering those answers and finding it elsewhere, the mystics at the margins of organized religion, very often, sometimes completely outcast, many of them not even allowed into the fold. But when we start uncovering those mystical fires for ourselves, I think we also begin to realize that there is a fire that somewhere burns at the heart of every tradition, but it takes time peeling away all the appurtenances that are irrelevant in order to get to that fire. So I'd say the priests, in some way, are performing their role, but it's not the role that excited me. I see myself as a spiritual seeker. I'm not terribly enamored of the exoteric aspects of religion, the outer aspects of religion. That doesn't excite me.
Hmm. How do you cultivate that fire within, right? Like, how do you become a mystic? Is it by setting more rules on yourself, being ascetic to a lot of what the spiritual traditions have talked about, like renouncing sexual relationships, meat, becoming a vegetarian, or whatever that looks like for you, like having a rigid meditation schedule? Like, how do you cultivate a stronger fire within?
It's a wonderful question. For these four women, Trey, I'll talk of them before I come to myself. For these four women, there is no single path. And that's why I wanted them in one book, because I'm not advocating any single path. And these four women amaze me and astonish me because they represent plurality on every level. Every level. In terms of temperament, one is cerebral, the other is utterly devotional. In terms of life choice, one has enabled her spiritual discovery to deepen through her engagement in a consort practice with a partner. The other has chosen to become a monk. And she reminds us that being a monk is a very contemporary modern option to exercise as well. So there's one who wears a monk's ochre, there's one who wears blue jeans, and there's another who wears no clothes at all. So really, what formula can there be? What formula can there
I
be?
love that because it's also different, and I think that's the point. I think that's what Jung talked about too. It's like you have this divine feminine concept of the archetype, and it only has to be the Holy Mother. Jung was like, we just want to put everything in a category and worship that one category. We don't even realize, the desert and the paradise, it's all one thing. It's all under one umbrella, but we want to just worship this. We want to put all our energy in one part of that self. Like, it's just like, to his point about individuation, we want to look at the conscious part of ourselves that we like, and we don't want to look at the unconscious part of ourselves that we fear. But
Yeah.
in order to know thyself, you have to look at it all and have this recognition that it is a part of the one. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the goddess is a reminder of that for us. I mean, for anyone who seeks to look at her. There's always the benign goddess, the beautiful goddess, and there's the fearsome goddess. Kali is the fearsome aspect of the goddess. And I have a whole book called Wild Women that was out in India last year, where I look at the concept of where I look at lots of goddess poems, and I think that the goddess is divided into these two polarities, if you like, because our minds are fragmented. But the invitation of the goddess is to those places where these compartments don't exist. And she reminds us really that illusion of separateness is the last illusion that we must divest ourselves of. And once we divest ourselves of that, there is no fearsome face of the goddess anymore. And that's really, Trey, where I think bhakti or devotion also invites us. It invites us to those toxic, festering places in the heart, in our own hearts, that we're too afraid very often to visit. But once we do, something starts being transformed. And we have nothing to do with that transformation. We just have to visit. We just have to go there. But the transformation happens not because we are sitting there meddling with or stirring the cauldron or any of that. We just go there. And the transformation begins to happen. But very often we just see devotion, as I said earlier, as I said, servility, but actually it's a very profound, radical science of intimacy with the divine, intimacy with the deepest parts of yourself. So I see bhakti really as a radical technology. That's much of my writing has been about reframing the idea of bhakti or
Sure.
devotion.
I love that, right? Because then you get too instilled in like one way of learning, and it's not
Mm,
until you make a different choice in which something totally opens up to you, like a new reality unfolds for you. The one thing I did like about the first two women in your book is that I think they had their gurus were in the non-physical; they were not
yeah,
physically here.
yeah.
So, have you ever experienced one of these archetypes for yourself?
Of the non-physical guru?
Yes.
Ah, I will say one thing, that I needed a physical guru, but the physical guru became, I realized very soon, or maybe not very soon, maybe it should have taken me, maybe I should have been quicker. But I realized that the physical guru only leads you to the non physical guru. That's the only journey there ever is. It's the only journey there ever is. The journey within, where you tune in to a place where the outer guru and the inner guru is really what you're seeking. This is, I could have said this to you, I could have mouthed all this to you because I'd read. So I knew all the things that one ought to say. Back in my teens, I could have said to you, as you could have probably said to me, Trey, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. I knew what all that was about. You're not supposed to look outside for it. It's all within. But these are cliches until you live them. You have to live them and experience them and know what it's like to actually begin to uncover that inner guidance. For me, it wouldn't have happened, I know, had I not met someone outside there whom I could talk to, argue with,
Argue.
uh, disagree with very often, and at the same time trust
How much did you argue with Sadhguru?
a lot.
Yeah.
I think a lot. Let me be fair to myself. I don't necessarily argue with him about the inner life, because I do think he has a certain understanding of the nuts and bolts of the inner mechanism of being human. I argue with him about his opinions on things and stuff. I've done a lot of that.
Well, how do you know when you're getting to the truth? Like when the guru is telling you truth as opposed to his opinions?
I realize that the opinions don't even really matter as far as the truth is concerned. Often I'd be having a disagreement on one level, seemingly sitting with him and saying, no, I don't agree, but something else is going on inside. I have to find a way to articulate this better, but really it's been like that.
Is it
It's
showing
been
you where you're stuck? Like when,
also,
like, it's also
also,
showing
one of
you
it
where you,
showing you where you're stuck or invested so deeply that you can't come out of it and just see the truth may not be the way you want it to be and the way you want to craft it. That's one part of it. The other is, I think, there's an attempt to just divert you, to distract you while something else is going on. You know, it's a bit like allowing how the kettle boils when you're looking the other way. So
yeah.
I think there's some of that at work. I don't know. I don't know how.
Every time that happens. That's funny you say that. Um, the divine feminine, like my tradition is, it's all about the God, the male God, right? Like the Christ, the daddy God in the sky and sitting on his throne and basically cutting us off from the divine feminine. And I find myself being pulled more towards the divine feminine. And it's funny, the Gnostic traditions, the story of Genesis really changed. I don't know if you read any of that, like the Secret Gospel of John, and
Yeah,
how their origin story is, right? Of Sophia and then Eve whispering into the ear of Adam to rise up and to stand up on earth. And he turns and he sees her and he says, "You are the great mother of life. You are the mother of life. You've given me life because you've awakened me from this slumber." And I have this connection with that mother aspect, that mother archetype. I
yes,
think all men have this yearning, not just, Freud would say for their physical mothers, but there is a yearning for the divine mother as
I
well,
yeah,
going back to that cosmic womb of
yes,
being. That's what we're all trying to find. We have awakened in this place and we do not know what it is, and so we automatically want to find out. But in that finding, it can be frustrating because it's like nothing, like everybody has a different interpretation of what this place is. I've talked to 500 different guests, like different mystics, psychologists,
mhm,
psychiatrists, channels, psychic mediums, and everyone. I mean, there is a commonality that we're all interconnected, but everyone has a different philosophy on what this place is. Some people
yes,
look at it as a soul trap, a planet. The Gnostics, surprisingly enough, thought that the demiurge is ruling this place, and the archons, these beings, are what created us and are trapped us in this matter, this physical body. But your tradition, I think, talks about embodiment, like
yeah,
being more in the body, which is a
yeah,
total opposite of what Socrates, Plato, and those guys talked about, Plotinus, of like, this body is an illusion. So why would I want to entice it? Why do I want to, reality is an illusion. So why waste my time on this physical body? Where you talk about embodiment, which is
yeah.
fascinating to me because there's so many different polarities. And again, it's like, it's all of that, it isn't just one. So what are your thoughts on that?
Mm. I think there are many strands even in the Indian tradition. There are strands certainly that would talk of transcendence, transcending the body, and there'd be a great emphasis on knowing yourself, which I think is inescapable, which is part of it. But unfortunately, sometimes what creeps in also is a mistrust of the body. That you have to in some way, because you're so embroiled, so completely entangled in this world of what is called samsara, it can seem like a big trap. So the only way is then to transcend it. But I think there have always been parallel traditions, even in India. That's where Tantra takes us, that's where even some of the Bhakti traditions take us, that remind us that the body is not an impediment, the body is an instrument of the sacred. And really, the mystics remind us of that, but Trey, there's really no one like the women mystics to remind us of that. You know, because even if you find strands of self-loathing in some of their poems, that's there. We are all in some ways conditioned by by the worlds in which we live. But there are also so many of these mystic poets who speak of inhabiting the body. You have a 13th century woman mystic called Janabai who says, I eat God. I sleep on God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here, God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without, and what's more, there's God to spare. So there's a sense of an abundance of God in the physical, in the non-physical, everywhere, and a God whom you can have this intimate relationship with. So even the women in this book that we're talking about, women who wear only themselves, contemporary women, all of them implicate the body in some way. They're not, it's not an earth denying material, anti-material relationship at all. It's just being able to see this very material and physical incarnation, but to see it transformed. So that requires a changed gaze. It also requires a changed way of inhabiting ourselves. So I love the way, for instance, Ma Karpuri, the monk, speaks of, yes, she goes through intense penance on a daily basis, very, very, well, not penance, but very, very intense sadhana or spiritual practice daily. But she also talks about the joy of washing her clothes in mud. It's a very earth nourished spirituality she's talking about. The tactility of it, actually dipping your clothes in mud, which is how the monks traditionally have washed their clothes. Or you have someone like Lata, the third woman in the book, who is an academic and scholar and spends a lot of her time in her head until one day she has a collision with a truck. Her life turns upside down in many ways, and she suddenly finds herself inhabiting the body in a way that she never had before, because she'd constantly spent her life in her mind. And the body is a site of agony. But from that agony and through that agony, something begins to shift. So the body is befriended in her case as well. It's not denied, it's not sidestepped. Or you have someone like the second woman in the book, the yogini. She says, their tradition, if you were to look at a pure, doctrinaire aspects of faith, women, when they had their period, were not necessarily encouraged to be chanting mantras. If at all, they were encouraged to chant mantras at all. Most often they weren't. For her, this is a process that has happened naturally. Sound pours through her. So she talks of, menstruation, and she talks about it as a reality of her life, and she gets on with it. She's not denying it, but she doesn't see it as an obstacle in any way to her journey. She just talks about a need for friendship sometimes. That's all she misses. And the first woman in the book, Trey, who just takes my breath away, chooses to peel off everything, including her clothes. She sits there in all her nakedness. You can't go and meet her without being reminded of the body. You just can't. She's there in all her nakedness, unapologetic. So it's a reminder to me of how many ways there are to trust the physical. Of course, we need to look at how much of our understanding of the physical is conditioned. A lot of it is conditioned. We need to peel away a lot of that.
Sure.
But,
Do you think that conditioning is what Saint Teresa talked about when you're entering in those inner castles, when you start going into have you read Saint Teresa? I'm assuming you have.
I read a little bit. And I've loved there are some sections I remember just loving. One of them is in which she talks about befriending God, or a God with a sense of humor or some such thing. There are many moments in Saint Teresa that I've
Yeah.
liked.
The thing that caught my eye was like when you start entering into the inner castles,
Yeah.
like you have the creatures that come after you, right? Like the reptilians or whatever, however she describes them. And I wonder if those are the conditionings that are coming towards your awakening, trying to pull you and grab you back into your old setting almost, to keep you from awakening, right? Have you noticed that for yourself as you gone down this path, as you made up your mind of I'm going to really pursue this path and really be committed? Have you noticed like a negative kind of reaction towards that pulls you back towards the common?
I think the demons come tumbling out for sure. They come tumbling out. And whether they're external or internal, I mean, I don't know if there's much of a difference anyway. We probably create some of our, those that seem to manifest externally. But there are challenges. The challenges are that you find one, I mean, just being surrounded by people who don't seem to get where you're at in itself, you could see them as presences that are in a way a deterrent to your path. That's one. The other is all the temptations along the way, all the digressions that are possible. We live in a world that's so distracting. There's so many ways you could head, all of that. And Yeah, the inner demons for sure. And I think it's Muji, the master Muji, who calls it the fish market that we set up at the gates of heaven, which I mention in my introduction to the book as well. I think there are many seductions as well. So not all our demons wear terrifying faces. Sometimes they wear very seductive faces and say, hang here for a while, settle down here for a while. And you have to keep picking yourself up and saying, no, not until you enjoy what the world has to offer, but you keep that inner commitment alive. I think that's really what it's about. um, so I personally, I don't judge too many people who seem to have strayed, because people's idea of what it means to stray from the path is often just based on very cosmetic understanding of what it means to be on a
Sure.
path. You don't have to look a particular way, but as long as you keep that inner commitment alive, hopefully, with the grace, we need lots of grace on the way, Trey. So, with the grace of the gurus and physical and non physical, with the grace of the goddess, hopefully, um, those demons can be can be looked at, and we can transform them along the way and move on, or not be as terrified by them. Let them exist, but we don't have to be terrified by them. We can move on.
I love that. Eliminate the fear that's associated with them, right? And they will have no power. One last question for you. Like, we're talking about the inner work. How do you know you're in the inner world? Like we say all of the time, don't go out. The kingdom of God is within you, but the kingdom is within you. Stop searching for the externals to save you. But how do you
Mhm.
know you're in the inner world? Is it sitting in meditation and all the thoughts go away and you're just kind of sitting there in the void and you're like, maybe this is the inner work? I don't know. But how do you know you're in the inner world?
I'd say that when you're meditating, and that's a wonderful example, I think when you're meditating, you're aware of a sense of self that is that's very present, but it's completely unclogged by opinion, prejudice. Even it even watches thought, with a certain innocence and a certain lack of judgment. If that gaze, which to me is God looking out at the world, or the goddess looking out at the world, that gaze, if we could find a way to allow that gaze to permeate more of our daily lives, that's the work, most of the work done. And I think you in some way that the path is working for you when you have more of those moments in your daily life, more of those moments when you're just looking, and not furiously judging, not furiously dividing, not furiously um, computing and calculating. You're just looking. The thoughts are there. Of course, they're there, but it's not the one that's looking. There's also the ability to look at some of those thoughts, exactly what you're talking about in meditation. When you find that happening more and more, it happens very gradually, it takes its time, but when that happens more and more in your daily life, in your everyday life, I think some of these divisions begin to blur. And I think that's how you know you're on a journey that's real.
Hmm. How do you think the a human incarnation develops a soul? If the soul is already perfect, like what is it about the human life that develops it, evolves that consciousness?
Yeah, I have no answers, Trey. I have no
That is the
answers.
$1,000,000
I
question.
really, I don't, asking me what it's all about, I have no answers. The closest that the idea in India that has always appealed to me is the idea of the Leela. This is the sport of God. And you're part of the sport, so you enjoy it. And I always tell myself, if it wasn't on some level deeply pleasurable to be inhabiting myself more profoundly than before, if it wasn't pleasurable, I wouldn't be doing it. It's just that you have to allow your understanding of pleasure to deepen too. And then you realize there are more pleasures in the depths than in the shallows. And so you allow yourself that. So I think for me, looking at it as play has helped me, recovering the joy of it also. Because my earlier life, I think, was about seeing myself as a poet in some sort of with a capital P, with an obligation to suffer in order to write. I'm glad I'm rid of that a little. I think I'd rather get rid of this obligation to suffer that I had somewhere internalized from the cultural climate. I'm there has to be a more joyful way, a more peaceful way to do it. And I think in our own way, by trying to live that out, hopefully we will shift the climate around us and make this human incarnation a more joyous one for those around us as well.
You're so right, because like it's if I'm not suffering, I'm not progressing, or if I'm not working hard, I'm not of worth. I'm not worthy enough. I think
Yeah.
those are the programs and the traumas that we struggle with, and I know that I do for sure. Just being growing
Mhm.
up in this generation in this society, that I'm worthy already, and that I when the body will tell you, like if you're overworking yourself or if you are um, overdoing it, because you'll just burn out. And
Yes.
when you are in your creation, like it's joyous. It's like when you're doing the thing that you love to do, like everything,
Yes.
success, all of that stuff comes naturally. But when you're like really trying hard, that's when the burnout hits and you're striving too much to meet a goal. And like, what is the goal? Like who gave you that goal? Right? Like who said you had to achieve that goal? Like why do you want that goal? Like you really got to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
But I'm super glad that I found your book and was introduced to your work, because I think it's beautiful. There's something about working with the logos, right? Like the words, and then even poetry. Um, your poetry is beautiful because it makes you think, right? Like it's artistic. Gets you out of that analytical brain and it gets you more into this flow state. And
Mhm.
I just can't thank you enough for the work that you do. How can people find you?
Thank you, Trey. I'm on arundhatisubramaniam.com. I think that's is that the right? Yeah, I think I'm a .com. Yes, that's my website. And the book is out, and I hope some of you, those who listen to you, will pick it up. It's called Women Who Wear Only Themselves. It's just been published. It should be
Arundhati, thank
available.
you so much for taking the time. I truly enjoyed this beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Trey. It unfolded in a way that I hadn't anticipated, and felt like a morning very well spent. Thank you.